In a forgotten Nevada town, a man with a ghost on his face sought only silence. But when a biker gang shattered that peace, they awoke a legend they weren't strong enough to face. The heat of the Nevada desert pressed down on the town of Oasis Springs like a physical weight. It was a place the highway had mostly forgotten, a collection of sun-bleached buildings and cracked asphalt shimmering in the perpetual glare. On a dusty side street stood the Last Round Saloon, its neon sign flickering with a tired, buzzing persistence, a lone beacon against the encroaching twilight. The name was fitting, a nod to the boxing memorabilia that lined its walls, faded posters of old champions, a pair of cracked leather gloves hanging over the bar, ghosts of a bygone era. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and quiet desperation. A few regulars were scattered around, men with faces like worn leather, nursing their drinks as if they held the answers to questions they'd long forgotten. Behind the bar, Hank, a man whose weary eyes had seen it all, polished a glass with a slow, rhythmic motion, his movements a silent meditation against the stillness. The heavy door creaked open, letting in a slice of the fiery sunset and a solitary figure. He was built like a man carved from granite, broad-shouldered and solid. He wore a simple, dark hoodie, the hood pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. Faded jeans and a pair of scuffed work boots completed the look of someone who wanted no attention, a man trying to become a ghost. The iconic tattoo curling around his left eye was just visible in the gloom, a faint whisper of a past he couldn't entirely erase. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. He didn't look around, didn't make eye contact. He just crossed the room and took the last stool in the darkest corner of the bar, a space that seemed to be waiting for him. Hank paused his polishing, his gaze lingering on the newcomer for a moment longer than usual. He recognized the silhouette, the sheer presence that filled the space. He'd seen him come in a few times over the past weeks, always the same. Silent. Still. The man finally looked up, his eyes meeting Hank's in the mirror behind the bar. "Water," he said. His voice was a low rumble, surprisingly soft but layered with a gravelly depth that commanded respect. It was the voice of a man who had shouted himself hoarse long ago and now had little left to say. Without a word, Hank filled a glass and slid it down the bar. The man caught it effortlessly. He pulled back his hood slightly, revealing the unmistakable face of Mike Tyson. It was older now, etched with lines of struggle and regret, but the intensity in his eyes was timeless. He took a slow sip of water, his gaze distant, as if he were looking through the walls of the bar and into a past that was always just over his shoulder. Here, he wasn't a champion. He was just Mike, a man seeking the one thing that had always eluded him, peace. That peace was shattered when the door flew open with a violent bang, slamming against the wall. 5 men stormed in, their laughter coarse and loud, filling the quiet space with an aggressive energy. They were the Vulture Crew, a local biker gang known for preying on the weak and leaving a trail of petty chaos in their wake. They wore dusty leather vests adorned with the snarling vulture patch, their faces set in sneers of practiced intimidation. Their leader, Jax Ryder, swaggered to the center of the room. He was wiry and hyperactive, with a mean, restless energy. His eyes, small and sharp, darted around the room, looking for a target. "Hank," he barked, slamming a greasy hand on the bar. "Line them up. The vultures are thirsty." The regulars hunched lower over their drinks. Hank's face tightened, but he complied, his movements becoming stiff as he began setting out bottles. The bikers hooted and hollered, grabbing the beers, their crude jokes echoing off the walls. One of them kicked a chair over for no reason, laughing at the clatter. They were peacocks of violence, puffing their chests in a room that wanted nothing to do with them. Then, Jax's eyes landed on the corner. He saw the solitary figure, unmoved by their entrance, a silent rock in their storm of noise. Tyson hadn't flinched, hadn't even turned his head. He just sat there, nursing his water, an island of calm in their manufactured chaos. Jax's grin turned predatory. "Well, what do we have here?" he said to his cronies, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. Someone didn't get the memo. He sauntered over, his boots scuffing arrogantly against the floorboards. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed leather followed him. He stopped beside Tyson, leaning in close. "Hey, champ," he sneered. "Didn't you hear us come in? Or are you too good for us?" Tyson finished his sip of water, setting the glass down with unshakable steadiness. He slowly turned his head, his gaze finally locking onto Jack's. His eyes were flat, devoid of fear or anger. It was the look of a man staring at an annoying fly. "I heard you," Tyson said, his voice a low vibration. The simple, calm response seemed to throw Jax off. He'd expected fear, or at least a reaction. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You heard me, huh? Then you know this is our bar tonight. And you're in my spot." Tyson's gaze didn't waver. He looked at Jax, at the cheap bravado and the deep-seated insecurity behind it. He'd seen 100 men like him in his life, in and out of the ring. All noise, no substance. "This is nobody's spot," Tyson said, his voice still quiet but carrying an undeniable finality. "Finish your drink. And leave." A ripple of disbelief went through the Vulture Crew. Jax's face, which had been twisted in a smug sneer, went slack with shock for a half-second before flushing a deep, mottled red. He took a step back, puffing out his chest. "What did you just say to me?" he hissed, his voice cracking with fury. No one in Oasis Springs talked to Jax Ryder like that. He was the local terror, the big fish in a very small, very dry pond. Tyson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his posture was more intimidating than any shout. "You heard me. This isn't a show. There's no audience here for you. Go home." One of Jax's men, a lanky biker with a nervous twitch, snickered. "He told you, boss." Jax shot him a venomous glare before turning back to Tyson, his humiliation curdling into rage. "Get up," he snarled, balling his fists. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? Get up and prove it." Tyson remained seated, his powerful frame perfectly still. He let out a slow, weary sigh, the breath of a man who had been dragged into this same tired dance 1,000 times before. "Son," he said, and the word hung in the air with paternal disappointment, "you're making a mistake you don't have the skills to recover from." That was the final straw. Blinded by fury, Jax made the move that would define the rest of his night, and perhaps his life. He snatched Tyson's glass of water from the bar and, with a triumphant yell, dumped it over Tyson's head. The bar went dead silent. The jukebox seemed to choke on its song. Every eye was fixed on the corner. Water dripped from Tyson's hoodie onto the floor, each drop landing with the weight of a ticking bomb. Slowly, deliberately, Tyson stood up. He didn't explode. He didn't roar. He simply rose to his full height, and the sheer presence of him seemed to suck the air out of the room. He was a mountain uncoiling. He brushed the water from his face, his movements economical and precise. "I was having a quiet night," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "And now you're having a bad one." Jax crowed, raising his fists in a clumsy parody of a boxer's stance. "Let's go, old man." What happened next was not a fight. It was a demolition. Tyson's body moved with a speed that defied his size, a terrifying blur of coiled muscle memory. Before Jax's first sloppy punch could even travel halfway, Tyson's left hand shot out in a piston-like jab. It wasn't a knockout blow, it was a rangefinder, a sharp, stinging impact that snapped Jax's head back with a wet crack. Jax stumbled, his eyes wide with shock and pain. A second biker lunged from the side, swinging a beer bottle. Tyson didn't even seem to look. He bobbed his head to the left, the bottle whistling past his ear, and pivoted. His right hand came up in a devastating uppercut that connected squarely with the man's chin. The biker's feet left the floor as he was lifted into the air, his body going limp before he crashed onto a table, shattering it to pieces. A third vulture, bigger than the others, tried to grab Tyson from behind. Tyson dropped his weight, spun on his heel, and drove a vicious elbow into the man's solar plexus. The air left the man's lungs in a choked gasp, and he folded like a cheap suit, collapsing to the floor, wheezing. 4 seconds. 3 men down. The remaining 2 bikers froze, their bravado evaporating into sheer terror. Jax was on his hands and knees, blood pouring from his nose, staring in disbelief. The other was backing away slowly, his hands raised in surrender. Tyson took a single, heavy step forward. He stood over Jax, a titan casting a long shadow. He didn't say a word. He just looked down, his expression not of anger, but of profound disappointment. I don't know who you are, Jax stammered, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Tyson leaned down slightly, his voice a low, chilling whisper that cut through the silence. You don't have to know who I am. You just have to remember what happens when you pour water on a stranger. He straightened up, adjusted his hoodie, and turned. The entire bar was frozen, a tableau of shock. Hank stood behind the counter, his mouth agape, a half-polished glass in his hand. Tyson walked back to his stool, pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket, and laid them on the wet bar. For the water, he said to Hank. Then, without another glance at the wreckage of the Vulture Crew, he walked out the door and disappeared into the desert night. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzzing of the neon sign and the pained groans from the floor. Then, someone in the corner shakily raised their phone, the small red light of a recording blinking in the darkness. The legend of the ghost fighter of Oasis Springs had just begun. The news of the beatdown at the Last Round saloon spread through the sun-scorched underbelly of Nevada faster than a brush fire. In a grimy, oil-stained garage on the outskirts of the county, the Vulture Crew's unofficial clubhouse, the mood was a toxic cocktail of humiliation and simmering rage. The shaky cell phone video was playing on a loop on a cracked laptop screen, each frame a fresh dose of shame. Jack sat in a rusted metal chair, a bag of melting ice pressed to his swollen face. His jaw ached, but his pride hurt more. Around him, the remnants of his crew nursed their own injuries, their usual boisterous arrogance replaced by a sullen, dangerous silence. He just moved, one of them muttered, watching the video for the 10th time. I didn't even see it. Shut up. Jack snapped, the effort sending a jolt of pain through his head. The garage door screeched open, and a new figure entered, casting a formidable shadow. This was Breaker Jones, Jax's second-in-command. Breaker was everything Jax wasn't, massive, quiet, and possessing a chillingly calm brutality. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his chin, a permanent reminder of a fight he'd actually won. He wasn't a leader, he was a weapon. He watched the video over Jax's shoulder, his expression unreadable. One man, Breaker stated, his voice a low gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. He got lucky, Jax spat, though the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. We weren't ready. Breaker's lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it held no warmth. Luck doesn't break 3 ribs and dislocate a shoulder in 5 seconds, Jax. That's skill. Or something else. He looked around at the beaten men. And now everyone's seen it. Everyone's laughing. The truth of his words hung heavy in the greasy air. Their reputation, the only currency they had, was in tatters. Jax slammed his good fist on a nearby workbench, rattling tools. So what do we do? We can't just let this go. Breaker's eyes glinted. No, he agreed slowly. We don't. You went in there with fists. We go back with more. He gestured with his chin toward a heavy steel locker in the corner. We go back with friends. We remind this whole damn town who the Vultures are. We're not just gonna beat him. We're gonna erase him. A dark energy began to stir in the room, the shame twisting into a unified, burning need for vengeance. Jax's eyes narrowed, a desperate fire lighting within them. He was in charge, but Breaker had just shown him the path forward. "Get on the phones," Jax commanded, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Call the chapters in Reno. Tell them it's time for a party. And someone find out who the hell that old man is." Meanwhile, back at the last round saloon, a fragile peace had returned. The next evening, Tyson was there, in his usual corner, a cup of steaming chamomile tea in his hands. Hank had started brewing it for him, an unspoken gesture of respect and gratitude. The broken table had been replaced, the floor mopped clean, but the memory of the previous night lingered like a phantom limb. The bar was quieter than usual. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the corner with a mixture of awe and fear. Hank wiped down the counter near Tyson, his movements still slow, but less weary now. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," he said, keeping his voice low. Tyson took a slow sip of his tea, the warmth seeming to soothe something deep inside him. "Nowhere else to go," he rumbled. "This is the quietest place I've found." Hank managed a dry chuckle. "Wasn't so quiet last night." He paused, then leaned in a little closer. "You know they'll be back, right? Guys like that, their pride is all they have. You took it from them." Tyson stared into his cup, his reflection distorted in the dark liquid. "Pride is a heavy thing to carry," he said softly. "Sooner or later, it makes you stumble." He looked up, his eyes meeting Hank's. "I'm not looking for trouble, Hank. I'm done with all that. But trouble seems to have my address." Just then, the door creaked open. Two men, vultures from the night before but not the ones who'd been hospitalized, stepped inside. They didn't swagger this time. They moved cautiously, their eyes immediately locking on Tyson. They took a table far from the bar, ordered nothing, and just sat there, watching. They were scouts. Sentinels of a coming storm. Tyson didn't acknowledge them. He finished his tea, his hands resting calmly on the cup. He was a man who had spent a lifetime studying opponents, reading their tells, anticipating their moves. He knew this wasn't over. He could feel it in the air, the low hum of violence gathering on the horizon, rolling in like a desert thundercloud. And he knew, with a deep, bone-weary certainty, that it was heading straight for him. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised, purple twilight when the rumbling started. It began as a low vibration felt through the soles of your shoes, a distant growl that slowly intensified until the bottles on Hank's shelves began to rattle softly. The few regulars in the last round saloon fell silent, their conversations dying in their throats. They moved to the windows, peering out into the gathering darkness. What they saw made their blood run cold. A fleet of motorcycles, at least a dozen, lined the street, their headlights cutting sharp, aggressive cones through the dust. Behind them, two battered pickup trucks screeched to a halt, their beds filled with more men. This wasn't the small crew from the night before. This was an army. The Vulture Crew had called in their reinforcements. They spilled into the street, a mob of over 20 men, their faces grim and set with purpose. They were armed now, not with guns, but with weapons meant to inflict brutal, personal damage. Heavy chains, steel pipes, baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire. At their head stood Jax, his face a mask of vengeful fury. Beside him, the hulking form of Breaker Jones was a promise of extreme violence, a heavy toe chain wrapped around his fist like a metal serpent. Inside the saloon, Hank's face was ashen. His hand trembled as he reached for the old rotary phone behind the bar. "I'm calling the sheriff," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy. Tyson, who had been sitting in his corner, stood up. He moved with a smooth, unhurried grace that was a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. He gently pushed his stool back under the bar. "They won't get here in time," he said calmly. His voice cut through the fear in the room, steady and absolute. He walked to the center of the floor, the worn wood creaking under his weight. He stood there, hands at his sides, a solitary island of calm in the face of the approaching tidal wave. He wasn't waiting for a fight, he was accepting it. This was his ring now. The saloon door crashed open. Jax, Breaker, and a vanguard of their most formidable-looking thugs stormed inside, fanning out to block any escape. The air crackled with tension, thick with the smell of gasoline and menace. "Nowhere to run, old man," Jax sneered, pointing a tire iron at Tyson. "We found out who you are. Used to be somebody, huh? Well, you're nobody now." Tyson's gaze swept over them, assessing, calculating. He saw the anger, the fear masquerading as bravado. He saw their numbers, their weapons. He let out a slow breath. "You brought a lot of toys," he rumbled, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes. "You're going to need them." The first thug, young and eager to prove himself, rushed forward, swinging a baseball bat in a wide, clumsy arc. Tyson didn't retreat. He flowed. With a slight dip of his shoulder and a pivot of his foot, a classic bob and weave, the bat whistled harmlessly over his head. Before the biker could recover, Tyson stepped inside the swing, his left hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The biker cried out as the bat clattered to the floor. Tyson's right hand delivered a single, precise palm heel strike to the man's sternum. It wasn't a punch, but the impact sent a shockwave through the man's body, and he crumpled, gasping for air. Two more came at him from opposite sides. Tyson moved like a dancer of destruction. He sidestepped the man on his left, using his momentum to guide him into the path of the man on his right. The two vultures collided with a grunt. As they staggered, Tyson delivered two short, brutal hooks to their ribs, thump, thump, like a butcher tenderizing meat. They both went down. Breaker roared and charged, swinging his heavy chain in a deadly, horizontal sweep. The chain sliced through the air with a vicious hum. Tyson didn't try to block it. He dropped, his body impossibly low, and the chain passed over him. As he came back up, he was inside Breaker's guard. He unleashed a furious combination, a blur of fists that seemed to strike from every angle. A jab to the face to blind him, a right cross to the jaw that rocked the giant's head back, followed by two lightning-fast body blows that sank deep into Breaker's midsection. The giant grunted, his breath stolen, his eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever stood and traded blows with him like this. Tyson finished with a thunderous uppercut that lifted the massive man off his feet. Breaker crashed backward into the jukebox, which exploded in a shower of sparks and broken glass, silencing the music for good. The room had become a whirlwind of motion and violence. Tyson was the eye of the hurricane, a point of absolute focus surrounded by chaos. He disarmed a man with a pipe, using the weapon against its owner with a series of swift, disabling strikes to the knees and elbows. He ducked under a wild swing from Jax, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to throw him over the bar, where he landed with a crash amidst the bottles. The remaining bikers hesitated, their attack faltering. The sheer efficiency of the destruction was terrifying. This wasn't a brawl, it was a masterclass in controlled violence. They had come for a gang fight, but they had stumbled into the ring with a prime champion. Jax crawled from behind the bar, his face bloody, a broken bottle clutched in his hand. "I'll kill you," he shrieked, lunging forward. Tyson met his charge with a final, devastating display of power. A left hook to the body that audibly cracked a rib, followed by a right cross that landed with the finality of a judge's gavel. Jax collapsed in a heap, unconscious before he hit the floor. Silence descended. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the victors and the groans of the vanquished. Tyson stood amidst the wreckage, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the groaning bodies of more than 20 men. He wasn't even breathing heavily. He slowly scanned the room, his gaze falling on the few remaining vultures who were still on their feet, frozen in terror. They dropped their weapons. One of them turned and fled out the door. Then another. In the distance, the faint wail of a single siren began to grow. Tyson walked over to Hank, who was huddled behind the bar, staring with wide, unbelieving eyes. Tyson placed his hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly. "Tell the sheriff," he said, his voice low and steady, that the trash took itself out. And with that, he turned and walked to the back exit, melting into the shadows of the alley just as the first flashing blue and red lights painted the front of the Last Round Saloon. In the aftermath, the Last Round Saloon became less of a bar and more of a landmark. The story of the second fight, the one no one filmed, grew into a modern myth whispered across truck stops and internet forums. The official police report was a masterpiece of understatement, citing a gang-related altercation with multiple injuries. But everyone in Oasis Springs knew the truth. They knew one man had stood against an army and won. The Vulture Crew was shattered. Like their namesake, they scattered to the winds. Jax and Breaker were facing a slew of charges, and their followers, stripped of their leaders and their bravado, simply vanished. The leather vests and snarling vulture patches disappeared from the roads. A quiet, unfamiliar peace settled over the town. Tyson was gone. After slipping out the back door, he had vanished as completely as a desert mirage. Hank kept his corner stool empty, placing a small, handwritten sign on it that simply said, "Reserved." No one ever questioned it. About a week later, a boy shuffled into the bar. He was maybe 16, skinny and nervous, with shoulders hunched inside a hoodie that was 2 sizes too big. He looked around anxiously until his eyes fell on Hank. Is he here?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hank shook his head gently. "Haven't seen him, son. What do you need?" The boy swallowed hard, pulling a grimy, oil-stained rag from his pocket. "My dad, he owns the auto shop down the street. The vultures, they used to come by all the time. Took what they wanted. Last month, they beat him up pretty bad. Broke 2 of his ribs." The boy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Since that night, they haven't come back. My dad, he's not scared anymore. I wanted to thank him." Hank felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the empty stool, then back at the boy. The quiet man hadn't just been fighting for himself, he'd been fighting for people like this kid's father. Then, a few days after that, another visitor arrived. This one was different. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked out of place in the dusty saloon. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried a thin leather briefcase. He sat at the bar, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Hank. "I'm looking for a man," the agent said, his voice smooth and professional. "Older, powerfully built. Likes to sit in the corner." Hank's expression became guarded. A lot of men fit that description. The agent smiled, a thin, humorless expression. He slid a business card across the bar. It was black with stark white lettering, Defense Intelligence Agency, Special Recruitment Division. "We know what happened here," the agent continued, his voice dropping lower. "We've seen the reports, heard the whispers. A man with his unique skill set is a valuable asset. There are places in the world where a man who can dismantle 20 armed opponents single-handedly is more effective than a drone strike. We want to make him an offer." Hank looked at the card, then pushed it back. "He's not a weapon for hire. And he's gone. People like him are never truly gone," the agent said, standing up. "They just wait for the right fight. If you see him, tell him we're looking. Tell him we can give him a purpose." He left the card on the bar and walked out, his polished shoes silent on the floorboards. That night, as Hank was closing up, he saw something on the floor under the reserved stool. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small, worn poker chip, the kind used in backroom games decades ago. It felt heavy in his hand. On one side, someone had painstakingly scratched 3 words into the clay composite: discipline, control, peace. Tyson had left it behind. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. A lesson he had paid a lifetime to learn. Hank carefully placed the chip on the bar, right in the center of the reserved spot, where it caught the dim light like a tiny, solitary star. For 3 weeks, the quiet held. The legend of the ghost fighter settled into the town's folklore, a story to tell wide-eyed tourists. The last round saloon enjoyed a steady stream of curious visitors, but the tense edge was gone. It felt safe. Then, on a Tuesday night, the door swung open, and the cold dread returned. It was Jax and Breaker. They were out on bail, their faces bruised and twisted with a venomous, bottomless hatred. Jax limped heavily, and Breaker's arm was in a sling, but the malice in their eyes was fully healed. Behind them, a handful of their most loyal, and most foolish, cronies lingered in the doorway, armed with crowbars and malice. Hank froze, a glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. The few patrons in the bar shrank back in their seats. "He's not here," Hank said, his voice trembling. "He's gone. You won." Jax let out a low, guttural laugh that held no humor. "Won?" he rasped, his eyes scanning the empty room and landing on the reserved stool. "He took our name. He made us a joke." He took a limping step forward. "We're not looking for him. We know he's gone. That's the point." Breaker stepped forward, his good hand gripping a crowbar. "If we can't burn the king," he growled, "we'll burn his castle." His gaze swept over the bar, the memorabilia, the terrified faces of the regulars. "We'll tear this whole place down. We'll remind this town what happens when you shelter our enemies." They were cornered animals, lashing out at anything they could reach. They weren't here for a fight, they were here for destruction, to salt the earth where they had been defeated. Hank's hand fumbled for the phone, but Jax was already vaulting the bar, sending the old man sprawling. Breaker raised his crowbar, ready to smash the historic bar top to splinters. It was in that moment of absolute despair that the door opened. Not with a bang, but with a soft, deliberate creak. Mike Tyson stepped inside. He wasn't wearing his hoodie this time. Just a simple black t-shirt that did nothing to hide the formidable power of his physique. He looked rested. Calm. And his eyes, fixed on Jax and Breaker, held a cold, final fire. A collective gasp went through the room. The vultures froze, their faces a comical mask of disbelief turning to pure, primal fear. They had planned this perfectly, ensuring their target was gone. They had been wrong. "I heard," Tyson's voice rumbled, filling the sudden, deathly silence, "you were looking for me." Jax stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. Breaker, his face pale, held the crowbar like a shield rather than a weapon. Tyson walked slowly, his boots making no sound on the floor. He stopped at the bar, his gaze falling on the poker chip Hank had left there. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over the scratched words. He closed his fist around it, then looked at the terrified men. "I tried to leave you with your lives," he said, his voice low and heavy with a terrible finality. "You should have taken the offer." What followed was not a fight. It was an erasure. It was swift, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Breaker's wild swing was met with a bone-jarring block and a three-punch combination that ended with the giant collapsing in a heap. Jax's panicked lunge was answered with a single, perfectly timed right cross that sent him spinning into darkness. The others didn't even try. They dropped their weapons and fled into the night. Tyson stood in the silent, wrecked bar. He uncurled his fist and placed the poker chip back on the counter, pushing it toward Hank. "For the peace," he said softly. Then he turned and walked out the door for the last time. His figure was swallowed by the vast, indifferent desert night, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind and a story that would be told for generations. The myth of the man who fought not for glory or for vengeance, but for a quiet corner in a noisy world. Some stories never really end. They just become legends. What do you think? Was Tyson a hero, or just a man pushed too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and please, always comment with respect for others' opinions. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with a friend.